But Jason, the dietary cholesterol being linked to cardiovascular disease has been debunked. Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I thought I would chat with you guys and gals a little bit about this today, because this is a point that people raise all the time when we're discussing certain things, but I feel like they're completely missing the point. Yes, dietary cholesterol. Okay, dietary cholesterol doesn't seem to be linked to cardiovascular disease or atherosclerosis, or even particularly to blood serum cholesterol. Okay, so that's true. But for some reason, every time I bring up what the studies do show and what foods do affect it, people throw that as a counter response. And I think it's because they're so hung up in that thing that's been debunked, and certain fringe nutrition and fitness communities have jumped onto that for so long that the people are not hearing that there are foods that happen to have a lot of cholesterol in them that have other things that contribute to cardiovascular disease, that they kind of miss the forest for the trees. Okay, they're hung up on the dietary cholesterol part, when it is the saturated fat that has been linked. And that's an important distinction. People say, well, what do you mean? They're all the same, but they're not the same foods. There are plant foods that are high in saturated fat. Okay, let's make this clear. There are plant foods that are high in saturated fat that have no cholesterol. There are also very low fat animal source foods that have a lot of dietary cholesterol, or significant amounts. You see where we're going? So yes, it is important to make that distinction, but then people jump up and say, well, you can eat tons of red meat and eggs, and whoa. No, because those foods and components of them are linked to these issues, but it's not because of the dietary cholesterol. And I think that's what throws people off, because yes, that wasn't a myth per se, it was a scientific hypothesis. Okay, it was a hypothesis to where they did find some correlation, and this was a big deal. A lot of it's been largely debunked, but like the Ansel Keys 7-nation study, which was done so long ago that it really isn't relevant today, because newer data has kind of shown issues with it. But yes, they showed that there was a link. Well, it makes sense that they found a correlation, but they found correlation, not causation. Now, it's debated as to, if there was a little bit of cherry picking with that. That's always been subject to scrutiny, and there does appear to have been some cherry picking with it. Okay, so we need to be clear on that. So it wasn't necessarily the best science from the conclusions, because it was correlational data in the epidemiology, and there was some cherry picking. All right, and that's a valid criticism of that, but that's a reason we don't use that anymore. Okay, we have modern studies, so when that even gets brought up, and you'll notice when people make these arguments, they always want to bring that 7-nation study up, but I'm like, why don't we just ignore all of that and work with current data? Like, why are any of you debating that anymore? Again, when people bring that up as their point of debate, you know that they're fringe. They're doing fringe stuff. They're not keeping up with the mainstream at all, and they have no clue what the science says, and that's the first sign that they're ignorant of it. Okay. Because again, if we go off the dietary cholesterol, well, egg whites and chicken breasts could be a problem. Skim milk and fat-free dairy could be a problem because they have, a decent amount of dietary cholesterol. But those are not really causing cardiovascular disease, are they? Because their saturated fat is extremely low. Possibly even zero. Coconut oil, palm oil particularly, has been linked to some of these issues. And that's a plant-based saturated fat with no cholesterol. So it's important to understand that. But saturated fat absolutely is linked to these things. Okay? And the data on that's pretty clear, and we know mechanisms of action. And it's because it elevates LDL-C. LDL-C is not just correlated with atherosclerosis. The leading experts have determined causation, right? And we know when LDL-C gets low enough, atherosclerosis completely stops progressing. Consistently, What we just haven't found is a way to consistently lower atherosclerosis once it is occurring. But when you look at the data on this, large saturated fat intakes are associated with a lot of problems. Now, some people are like, but I do this sort of diet and those problems, a lot of them seem to be slightly improved. They're improved, but it's because you're cutting other bad stuff out of the diet too. A lot of refined carbohydrates, a lot of refined sugar. So yeah, if you're eating multiple really bad things and you cut in large amounts and you cut one of them out and you leave some others relatively high, you're going to see improvements. Like that should be common sense. But it doesn't mean that the saturated fat is still not contributing, because we've got good data at this point in the lab, in vitro, in humans, to where saturated fat intake, significant amounts of it, absolutely causes insulin resistance. It has been measured in the lab repeatedly and consistently. Okay? So if we're even going to talk glucose levels, not even just cardiovascular disease, yes, it contributes seriously to insulin resistance. It contributes to visceral fat and organ fat and liver fat. So again, you'll see the people on the other end say, well, all this refined sugars, and particularly the refined fructose, of course, and we know the mechanisms of action there, contribute to fatty liver. Yes, absolutely. But so does saturated fat. In fact, those are the two leading culprits outside of alcohol. Okay? I mean, obviously alcohol is a big deal, but we're at a point like in America where we eat more of those other foods than alcohol. So they're the biggest contributors. It's just that alcohol would be if it was evenly intaked. Sure. So that's what causes it. But just because people point out and say, well, one of them causes it doesn't mean the other doesn't. And I feel like this is where we run into problems, right? Because we determine that there's a couple of foods or specific components of foods that create certain issues. So just because you show that one of them causes it doesn't mean that the other doesn't. And obviously it makes sense that if you reduce either one, you're probably going to see some improvements. Okay? But that doesn't mean that there's not a problem with the one you're still eating. It's just that you're, cutting down the amount of negative stuff creating a problem. So we have to look at it from that perspective. So people are missing that, and they're not understanding that there's a lot of data on saturated fat creating issues. We've measured it in the lab, not just in the epidemiology, which we have. It has been measured in the epidemiology. It's been measured in the lab, and we know the pathways by which it causes these problems. Like this is pretty well shown in the data. But it's not the dietary cholesterol, and we all understand that. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys and gals next time.